The story of Lois and Clark is probably one of the most famous romances in the DC comic book universe. Oh, Lewis and Clark from, okay. No, I'm sorry. No, I'm good. Yeah, we can do Lewis and Clark. That's who we're talking about today. Lewis and Clark. Alright, so in the last lesson we focused on some of the early things that happened in President Thomas Jefferson's administration. You can check out that video right here. However, today we're going to be looking at some of the problems and some of the big decisions that Thomas Jefferson had to make. And President Thomas Jefferson is about to have to make some very tough decisions that are really going to test what he believes about the powers of the federal government. You remember in our last video we talked about how President Thomas Jefferson actually kept around a lot of the things that the Federalist presidents before him had allowed to take place. And so he's kind of living in this gray area of he's a Democratic Republican by principle, but he's allowing lots of federal activities to go on. Well, now we're going to see President Thomas Jefferson make one of the biggest big government moves in the history of the United States. Let's check it out. So you'll remember that one of the key cities here in North America was the city of New Orleans. And the city of New Orleans has been under the control of a few different European powers. At this point in history, it's under the control of Spain. You remember during the Pinckney Treaty that Thomas Pinckney was able to negotiate the right of deposit for American goods in the city of New Orleans. That meant that we could leave our goods there without any taxes being charged while they waited for the ships to pick them up and take them to their destinations. Well, eventually Spain cancels the right of deposit. They throw away the treaty. And then on top of that, in the Convention of 1800, Spain gives all of the territory in the New World that it owned back to its original owner, which was France. So before we could even protest this loss of the right of deposit, France was in charge and they certainly weren't going to give us the right of deposit in New Orleans. And so Thomas Jefferson is starting to think about what he can do to fix the situation. Another thing that also worried Thomas Jefferson was this guy in France named Napoleon. Napoleon looked like he was getting ready to invade parts of the French possessions and maybe even parts of the United States in the New World, and he had to defend against this. Now, if you remember, Thomas Jefferson had slashed lots of the military budgets. He'd also slashed lots of the funding to the Navy, so he definitely didn't want to get in a war with Napoleon and with the French. So what does he decide to do? He decides to negotiate. So Thomas Jefferson sends Robert Livingston and a delegation over to France to negotiate the purchase of the city of New Orleans, maybe even East and West Florida, from the French. Originally, the French kind of dismiss this whole idea of buying the city of New Orleans because in their minds, the French are going to eventually conquer that land. But then because of a series of unfortunate events for Napoleon, he is forced to consider this purchase brought to the table by these Americans. Then he also thinks, hey, I can sell some land that I'm planning on conquering later. I'd be dumb not to do this, right? Yeah. So Napoleon decides he's going to sell all of the land in North America that France owns to these Americans. Well, Robert Livingston was only told to buy New Orleans and maybe parts of Florida. And then Napoleon comes to the table with this offer of buy all of the French territory in the New World. Well, that would effectively double the size of the United States with that one transaction. And eventually Robert Livingston says, you know what, we're going to do it. And he agrees to a sum of $15 million. Eventually they factor that out to be 2.8 cents per acre, which is like the greatest real estate deal in the history of real estate deals. So Robert Livingston tells Thomas Jefferson that he has an agreement on the table from Napoleon to buy all of the French territory in the New World, including the city of New Orleans. This was a huge get for the United States, but according to Thomas Jefferson's principles, the federal government should not be allowed to do this. And so he has to decide, is he going to go with what he believes is right and true by the strict interpretation of the Constitution? He doesn't have these powers, so he can't claim these powers. That'd be a Federalist move, bro. Or he can decide to make this purchase and grow the power and prestige of the United States. This is a really tough call for old Thomas Jefferson. Well, eventually Thomas Jefferson decides to pull the trigger on the offer, and he purchases all of this land from France for $15 million. And now the United States is twice the size that it was. And now we got to figure out what we bought. There's a verse in the Bible that talks about the foolishness of someone who buys something and then goes to inspect it after he buys it. That was kind of the United States with this one. However, we knew we were getting a lot of land, so we knew it was a good deal, but now we got to see what's on this land. So in order to see what's on this land, he hires two guys to lead up an expedition. The first one is the brother of a famous figure from the War for Independence, George Rogers Clark. His brother, William Clark, is recruited by Thomas Jefferson to lead this expedition, along with one of President Jefferson's own personal secretaries, a guy by the name of Meriwether Lewis. And so Lewis and Clark and 27 other guys embark from St. Louis in the year 1804 to go check out this land that the United States has just purchased. They followed the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, they went up onto the Columbia River in Washington, they even get to the Pacific coast via the Snake River in Oregon. Their whole job was to record the type of plants and animals they come in contact with. All right, take notes on the natives, the people who live in this new land that they now own. They were to explore and see what type of commercial profits might be made off of this new land. And finally, they were also in charge of looking for some pesky British that might have built some forts there in the heart of this new land that we didn't know about. The Lewis and Clark expedition is a very important one. But it almost didn't make it. They were having some trouble, but eventually they run into a French trapper, and he is married to a Shoshone Indian woman. And this Shoshone woman, by the name of Sacagawea, is able to act as a guide and an interpreter, which was a huge get for the Lewis and Clark expedition. In fact, there was a time when they were kind of lost and running out of food, and they run into what they thought was a hostile Indian party, but it turns out to be Sacagawea's brother, and she's able to negotiate and gets many horses from that tribe for the expedition. Things were great thanks to Sacagawea. The expedition probably would not have been successful at all. Many men likely would have died if it wasn't for her intervention in several key areas. Well, eventually in 1806, after 28 months exploring this new land, the Lewis and Clark expedition returned to Washington, D.C. with information about this new land. Turns out it's an incredibly diverse piece of land. Over 9,000 miles were traveled by the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they bring Thomas Jefferson the information that he needs. He's saying this is a great opportunity for land for American farmers, and then he thought it was also a great opportunity to move Indians into this land, something they would eventually do, but not the way that Thomas Jefferson wanted them to do it. It actually was not a great thing at all in American history. However, we see the Lewis and Clark expedition is able to explore lots of this land. After the Lewis and Clark expedition, and really kind of at the same time as the Lewis and Clark expedition, you see another expedition sets out into this land, led by a man named Zebulon Pike. Lewis and Clark kind of focused on the northeastern parts of the Louisiana territory, whereas Zebulon Pike is more in the central and southern parts of the Louisiana territory, exploring, coming across lots of different things. He took the Arkansas River, followed it up into the Rockies in Colorado. In fact, one of the tallest mountains in that range is named after him today, Pikes Peak, after being captured by the Spanish for sailing on the Rio Grande River. He comes back and reports lots of things as well. So the United States has grown in its possessions, but was that the way that Thomas Jefferson wanted it to be? He actually had to ask Congress for permission to buy all this land in the first place. But we see here that the land purchased by Thomas Jefferson turns out to be a huge acquisition for the United States of America and greatly shapes our future as we seek to expand west into this land. Thomas Jefferson was forced to make some pretty tough decisions, and really by the end of it, the Federalist Party kind of dies off because Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, had embraced so many Federalist policies that lots of people just kind of felt they were all Democratic Republicans. Turns out Thomas Jefferson was right when he said we are all Federalists, we are all Democratic Republicans, because we're all Americans. Felt like I rambled a lot in that one, but there's some good information in that video. Hope you got it written down in your notes. We'll check you later. Like and subscribe. See ya.